the fullness of Torah, the fullness of Messiah, the fullness of the Spirit, the fullness of the nations. And then Paul has for us a fifth fullness, one that most people don't ever think about, but it's crucial. It's the fullness of Israel. Going back to Romans 11, in the middle of the chapter, Paul is talking about this interplay between Israel's apparent no to Yeshua and the yes of the nations to Yeshua. And he's talking about, what is God up to here? Why has God designed it so that Israel would, for such a long time, in general, not completely, because there is a remnant among Israel that has said yes. But why did God design it that the majority of Israel would say no for so long? And Paul deals with that question here. And look what he says here about the middle of the chapter. Back to Romans 11, he says in verse 13, he says, I am talking to you Gentiles inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. That's my job. I'm talking to you because this is what I do. And he says, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. That some of them would say yes right now. He says, I want, even what I do among you Gentiles is for the sake of Israel. I've always got them in mind. And God always has Israel in mind as well, believe me. We've never been out of his mind. In fact, when God was working among Israel in the very beginning, the father of the Jewish people, Abraham, the Gentiles weren't out of God's mind either. Because God said to Abraham, he said, get out of your country, leave your father's house, go to the land I will show you. I will make of you, Abraham, a great nation. Actually, his name was Avram at that time. He didn't become Abraham until a little later. Avram, I'll make of you a great nation, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So God, even when he was working primarily with the Jewish people, still had the nations in mind. And Paul says, even though I'm working primarily with the nations in mind, I and God himself still have the Jews in mind. Reading on in verse 14 of Romans 11, we read this. Verse 15, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, that is, if the Jewish people's declining of the good news, or perhaps if God's setting them aside, maybe this term rejection applies to God having temporarily set Israel aside. If their rejection meant the reconciliation of the world, the Great Commission, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Whoa, what a statement. He says that there's coming a time when the Jewish people are going to say yes in huge numbers, because that's the way God has designed it. After the fullness of the nations has come in, then all Israel will say yes. Paul goes on, he says, if their transgression, that's another way he talks about how Israel's no, if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the nations, for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? There's that word fullness again, the fullness of Israel. He's saying their loss meant riches for the nations. When the Jewish people said no, the Jewish people lost out on something when they said no. But he says their loss brought riches to the nations. But there are greater riches in store when they say yes. And he calls this their fullness. Let's go back to Romans 11, because Paul puts it all together, beginning in verse 25. Here's what he says. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. He's warning the Romans over and over again not to be arrogant or conceited about the Jews, which was a problem amongst the Roman intelligentsia. They began to think, boy, those Jews, how dumb they must be. Look, we got it. Why didn't they? He says, don't be so conceited. God designed it that way for your benefit. Don't be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. God is going to turn a corner in his dealings, and Israel will be center stage again. He says, the deliverer will come from Zion, quoting from Isaiah. He will turn away godlessness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. This is about what God is going to do. He's going to do something enormous amongst the Jewish people. He says, take away their sins. He says, turn away godlessness from Jacob. As far as the gospel is concerned, you Gentiles, they have been enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, God's choice is concerned, the Jewish people are beloved on account of the patriarchs. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Beloved on account of the patriarchs, because of God's promises to the patriarchs and because of their faithfulness to him, God has said, your children, your children's children, your descendants will always be my chosen people. And Paul says, that promise is irrevocable. And so all of us need to realize that in the fullness of time, God is going to be turning back to the Jewish people to bring my people to a tremendous fullness. Tremendous fullness. So let's get back to our fingers now. The first fullness, the fullness of Torah. Then the fullness of Messiah, the fullness of the Spirit. The fourth fullness, the fullness of the nations. And then the fifth fullness, the fullness of Israel.